Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming out to night 2 of our conference of West of the White House, the Frontier in the American Presidency. My name is Jeffrey Engel. I have the honor of being the David Gergen Director of the Center for Presidential History here at SMU. And this has been a wonderful conclusion tonight of a 2-day event looking at this topic, of course, West of the White House, which we've done in partnership with the Clements Center for Southwest Studies, the Dedman College Interdisciplinary Institute, try saying that 5 times, the Lawlor Library, and also the George W. Bush Presidential Library. So it's been a group effort all around. And today we had a full day of workshopping the different chapters that our 10 contributors are offering, 5 of which you'll hear about tonight. We had a vigorous discussion over what direction West was. That was good. We also discussed whether, chronology, that is going in order of time, is so outdated, But nonetheless, all good, important academic topics. And tonight, we have the opportunity to hear from 5 scholars on their work. We're going to have each of them talk for a little over 5 minutes, I think, about their projects. And then we'll have the opportunity for them to, after our 2 days together, pit each other against each other for their questions. And then also have the opportunity for you folks to ask questions as well. And we will bring around a handheld mic to you, and I'll ask when you raise your hand for the questions if you wouldn't mind waiting for the mic so we can make sure that your voice is recorded on the recorder for posterity. So, without further ado, let me introduce our speakers for this evening. And they're actually sitting in exact order. Wow, well done, guys. First is T.J. Stiles, who is the author of 3 books, Custer's Trials, The First Tycoon, and Jesse James, 2 of which received the Pulitzer Prize, if I understand correctly, which means wonder what you do with the 3rd. But better luck next time.
It was the first one.
First one, okay. Okay, so you're getting better. That's good. I like that. That's nice. He has been a 2011 Guggenheim Fellow in Biography. He was the first Gilda Lehrman Fellow in American History. And he currently serves on the governing boards of the Authors Guild, the Organization of American Historians, and the Society of American Historians. Next to TJ is Julie Reed, who is a historian of Native American history, with an emphasis on Southeastern Indians and Cherokee history and American education. Her current project, which is tentatively titled, "The Means of Education Shall Be Forever Encouraged in This Nation, a Cherokee and American Educational History," reconsiders Cherokee educational history. She holds degrees from the University of South Florida, from here in SMU, and from the University of North Carolina, and she also was previously a Clements Center Fellow. And her first book was Serving the Nation, Cherokee Sovereignty and Social Welfare, 1800 to 1907, which came out from the University of Oklahoma Press. Next to her is Ruth Lawlor, who has probably the best job in America, I would think. You're asking why could that be? Well, the obvious answer is because she teaches at Cornell University. Okay, thank you. Second best job after SMU. Okay. With a focus on war, gender, and labor. She was previously a visiting fellow at Yale and Boston University and taught history at the University of Cambridge, from which she received her PhD. Her first book on the U.S. military and sexual violence in World War II is forthcoming from the Oxford University Press, and she has written on topics that have appeared in Diplomatic History, Modern American History, and the Journal of Military History. Next to her is Aileen Teague, who is an assistant professor at the Bush School at Texas A&M University. She received her PhD in history from Vanderbilt University in 2018. She teaches classes on U.S. history and relations with Latin America and serves also as the faculty coordinator for the Latin American concentration at the university. Her first book, Dirty War on Drugs, the United States, Mexico, and the Origins of Militarized Policing, is coming out from Oxford University Press. And finally, we have Augusta DeLomo, who is a postdoctoral fellow here at the Center for Presidential History. She received her PhD from a much lesser institution, the University of Texas. Is that right? Yes, Texas. That's what it says. Yeah. I'll speak in small words, Augusta, don't worry. Her research agenda has focused broadly on the global white supremacist movement. Her book, coming out soon from Columbia University Press, is Saving Apartheid, White Supremacist Internationalism on the Cold War's End. And she is going to be discussing that topic and more for, actually not that period tonight. Without further ado then, I'm going to turn things over to TJ and let you tell us what you presented today.
Is this working? Okay, good. Thank you. I am going to speak for 5 minutes as promised. My contribution to this volume that we're working on comes from my current work, my ongoing work in a biography of Theodore Roosevelt, who I took up because no one's ever written about him before. That or I hate myself, one of the two. And of course, he is very famously the president who was deeply engaged in the West. I believe the count is, as president, he preserved 230 million acres in the West, introduced the Federal Wildlife Preserve, named countless, well, you can count them, but I don't have the numbers, national monuments, signed into law 5 national parks, and he's very famously associated with the conservation and the West. During his lifetime, he was, even before he became president, he was drawn upon by the Republican Party to campaign in the West because he was such a popular figure there. And of course, that all relates to his years as a rancher in the Dakota Territory and North Dakota as it became, which he took up following the death of his wife and his mother, though, as I argue, not because of it. It happened to be a coincidence in time. But what I focus on specifically is the most difficult and the most horrible, in fact, aspect of Theodore Roosevelt's life. And I find a great deal to admire in his career, and I find much that's likable about him as a person. But one thing I absolutely can't defend, and we have to account for, is his attitude toward Native people. And it's important because on a biographical scale, we have to understand how he had such harsh thoughts about Native people. And historically, we have to understand what that says about American history, about the place of Native people in American history, and also to piece apart the ways in which Native history is very different from any other oppressed minority group, very distinct. And this comes through very clearly in Roosevelt's thinking and his actions leading up into his presidency. So when he was a young man, perhaps I think was 27 years old, he came east from his ranching. He actually oscillated between East and West. And he gave a talk about the West at the Young Men's Institute in New York. And he said, I should be ashamed, you'll have to pardon me for these words, I should be ashamed of myself for saying so, but I take the Western view of the Indian. I wouldn't say that the only good Indian is a dead Indian, but I would say probably 9 out of 10 are, and I wouldn't like to inquire too closely into the case of the 10th. That's shocking even at the time to endorse the outright genocide of Native people. There were very few people at that point in the 1880s who were arguing for extermination, though there had been many earlier. Now, as he went on in his life, he went west multiple times, not only in his ranching, but he also went west on a tour of reservations and boarding schools and other Western federal facilities as a U.S. Civil Service Commissioner. This is a time of 6 years in his life before he became vice president and later president, when he really saw how the federal government worked on the ground, at the grassroots. And he spent a lot of time with Native people and with federal agents in the West. He investigated conditions of not only schools, but homes, education, and health care, all aspects of Native life on the reservations he toured. And this personal contact showed a change in his attitude toward Native individuals. And he never again spoke in that murderous, we have to say murderous way about Native people, stopped calling them savages, stopped using that explosive language. However, he never retreated from his idea, in fact, he doubled down on it, that while he came to respect Native people, he rejected everything that made them peoples. And that what defines the Native place in North America in the whole history of European colonization, of the U.S. establishing its borders from coast to coast, of the expansion of settlement, is the fact that Native people were sovereign entities that were talking about not just racial issues, even though race obviously comes up, prejudice comes up, as it does in the case of Theodore Roosevelt, but we're talking about group rights. And one of the things I do in my essay, my contribution, is to look at Roosevelt's attitudes in the constitutional history of the United States and trying to think very broadly about the nature of the settler colonialist conflict and the native world. And one thing is the constitutional aspect. Before the Civil War, for the most part, in horrible ways, the Constitution recognized, as interpreted by the courts, recognized groups, much more than it did individuals. The Bill of Rights was considered to be a matter for the federal government only. After the Civil War, still, the U.S. dealt with Native peoples directly, but it rapidly moved toward shutting that down. And so it was actually the Reconstruction Congress of 1871 that passed the Ku Klux Klan Act to fight in favor of voting rights for black people, as it tried to establish civil rights for African Americans. In the West, it passed a law saying we will no longer treat tribes as sovereign entities and make treaties with them. So this is one of the great ironies and horrors of American history, which we see reflected in Roosevelt's life and his thinking, that the great revolution of universal individual rights, of the Constitution as a charter of individual citizenship, the universalism of that was used as a cudgel again to break down native nations, group rights, that autonomy and cultural autonomy. And as we follow Roosevelt's life, not only from through that 1892 trip west, but into his presidency, we see him saying, as he said in his first message to Congress, anything that we can do to, it's long past due, he said, to treat the native as an individual and make them citizens, and to eliminate their standing as in tribes, to eliminate the tribes. And that he pushed forward that work. He did not start it, and thank goodness he didn't finish it. But that was a historic development that he was very much an advocate for. And as a popular thinker and writer, he pushed. Now, he did encounter Native people, both in his service in the Army, when he briefly served in the War of Spain, and in excursions like his trip west in 1892. And yet he did not listen to those voices, those calls for autonomy, for cultural distinctiveness, for sovereignty. He really believed in a European world order and that it must supplant the rest of the native world that existed here before, and refused to accept the legitimacy of native entities and of native culture. Diversity was not something, tolerance were not things that he went for. And as one of his great personal conflicts for us, but for him, he saw no conflict. And so it's not a very happy tale, I'm afraid, but it's important to understand his views not simply as a matter of personal prejudice, but to see them within that historical context that he endorsed and very much pushed forward.
So thankfully, that vision was not carried out. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here today. My work right now, my second book is coming out on education, and this is actually the kind of beginnings of thinking about 20th century Cherokee history for a co-authored third book, which will be, it's titled Sovereign Kin, A History of the Cherokee Nation. Looking at kind of the full array of Cherokee history from the archaeological record, basically almost to the present day. And so part of that is thinking through kind of the big questions that have played out in recent years that the public may or may not be interested in, but has certainly captivated the media. And one of those that I was particularly interested in is our Principal Chief of the Cherokee Nation, which is, of course, one of 3 federally recognized tribes, in 2022 went before a congressional committee, calling upon the congressional committee to honor our 1835 removal treaty, which included a provision for a delegate to Congress. And so our chief has essentially asserted that right and has actually seated a delegate and is just waiting on the federal government to honor that treaty provision at this point. So, so one of the questions, of course, that comes up for people is like, where did that treaty provision come from? And so I'm really interested in kind of laying out the framework for those treaty provisions, which exist for 3 to 4 other tribes. It's not necessarily one that's in treaties across the board. And also that there's an irony to it being pretty spelled out in our removal treaty, the treaty that winds up costing us 1/4 of our population. And also that has a kind of life beyond that. If we look at things like the treaty with the Confederacy that the Cherokee Nation signed, which had an even stronger delegate provision language. And then, of course, the Cherokee Nation signs an additional treaty with the U.S. after the Civil War that reinstates those earlier provisions and treaties. But the other piece that I find kind of interesting and fascinating, why our chief was able to do this today, is that we currently have 470,000 Cherokee people enrolled in the Cherokee Nation, which is only about 115,000 less than Wyoming. So that population, those demographics matter. Now, most of those people are like me. They don't live in Oklahoma on the Cherokee Reservation. We are at-large Cherokees living both in other states, but also around the globe. But we can pick up the phone and call our senators and say, you need to honor this treaty, regardless of where we live. And the investigation kind of triggered a question from Congress. And it's one that, on the surface, I'm not even interested in talking about, in that for those of us that are citizens of the nation, there isn't a question, there's a treaty. And at the end of the trail, there was a promise. And so, that there are arguments to be made, that the only argument is that the treaty provision exists. But for Congress, there are some additional questions, and that includes questions about double representation. And so, I'm thinking through this question of double representation, both as a potential counter-argument to it, but it got me thinking about all the ways that representation is almost mythic anyways, that the Electoral College has problems. The Senate versus House representation has problems. The Three-Fifths Compromise had problems. That we have a whole range of places that we can look to in the history of the United States where we don't have perfect representation. We have diminished representation. We have muted representation. And if we look at kind of more contemporary issues, for instance, placing prisons in very rural white communities that are filled with Black and brown men who are being counted in those local areas as numbers, but don't actually have voting rights within those areas, right? So they're inflating the power of those districts while at the same time having their vote erased. So I think all of these questions are interesting more broadly in the history of the United States, but there's also ways that I think we have to think about them in particular related to the Cherokee Nation's treaty provision more broadly. As it relates to Native people, I think there's other kinds of interesting questions as well, that we have a kind of dilution of power more broadly. So if we think about a place like the Navajo Nation, which can't vote as a singular block to get all 400,000 of those votes in one state or one area, they're split across the Four Corners region. They're split across 4 states. So the other piece that also interested me is that what I'm describing is Cherokees living everywhere, so there's kind of no boundaries attached to our voting in some ways. And then additionally, I think there's also a distinction, perhaps, that we don't even have enough information for, in that I'm fascinated by this idea that we don't actually know that much about Native voters in this country. So for any of you that were paying attention a few years ago, during our last election cycle, they had something else on the screen on CNN where they just dumped Native peoples in polling. And that's very often how Native people get treated, that we're inconsequential and we aren't even named in many instances. So we don't know how Native people vote. And there's a lot of assumptions there that how I vote in the state of Pennsylvania would somehow mirror how I would want my elected officials to vote on behalf of Cherokee people. We don't know. And so I think there's just a lot of questions that are raised. So much of what I'm trying to do in this piece is think through those questions and alongside these questions of representation that aren't clean and neat in the larger United States, and certainly aren't clean and neat when it comes to imagining a non-voting delegate for a native nation. And I think that's actually kind of exciting to think that we don't necessarily have a singular model, and why can't we imagine something different on behalf of tribal sovereignty? Perhaps it's the least we could do, is imagining something different. And so part of this is just me thinking through these questions, but also really intrigued by what they potentially represent for Native nations moving forward in a nation as they try to get representation as a nation, as opposed to as individual citizens of the larger nation state. So yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out this evening to hear our panel on the 20th century. I am writing a chapter for this volume and a broader book project about the history of the US military in Alaska. And this focus on Alaska, to pick up on what Jeff was saying, perhaps reorients the geography of the frontier for us, because rather than thinking solely on an east-west trajectory, we can also think both about the north in relation to the south, but perhaps even scrambling that linear idea of an axis on the compass altogether by thinking about the circumpolar north as another region within the frontiers in the history, in global history, you might say. And I think it's helpful to do this because Alaska defies easy categorization. So yesterday, the panelists opened their discussion of the 19th century by asking, where in the world is the West, actually? And I began my chapter by asking, well, where is Alaska? There are some things that many of you probably know about it, some unusual things. Alaskans like to remind Texans that the state is more than twice the size of Texas, but it's actually more than the size of the next 3 states combined, California, Montana, and Texas together. So it's really large. But I would say perhaps there are other ways in which focusing on Alaska reorients many of the principles of American geography that we think we're familiar with. So if we include Alaska in the history of the United States, then it puts the halfway point of the east and the west of the country closer to California than to Kansas. Many Americans in the 19th century thought that San Francisco was actually now the halfway point of the US geography once the Alaska Territory had been acquired by military annexation. But the eastern and westernmost cities in the United States are also in Alaska because the territory crosses the international date line at the 180 degrees meridian in what's called the Western Aleutians, but also could be the Eastern Aleutians, depending on the perspective that you take. The other interesting thing about Alaska is that it has, at many times in its history, so not consistently because the demographics and the position of Alaska within US history has changed a lot since the mid-19th century, but it has been one of the most militarized places in the country, which basically means that at many significant moments of military buildup there, the ratio of the civilian to military population is greater than in other similarly militarized places, and the number of members of our armed forces who come from Alaska is higher than in other parts of the country. So if I give you some examples, in the year 1940, there were 700,000 people in Alaska, about half of whom were Native people, and 500 military personnel. But that should be 70,000 people. And then at the height of the Second World War, the population tripled, but the military population expanded by 600%, as more than 250,000 military personnel were deployed there. And at the height of the Cold War, the military population was 45% of the territory as a whole, if you include military families. So it has a very unusual social structure as a result of its important position within the national security framework of the United States. Alaska is also, of course, famous for its status as the last frontier. So that's how it fits very explicitly into the theme of this volume. But it's a misleading characteristic, and one that owes a lot to ideas of, I suppose, imperial ideas of the romantic sublime that were attached to Alaska as many tourists and travelers went there in the 19th century. It sort of acquired this designation because at a moment when Americans believed that the frontier, a place where martial vigor and new profits to be made were possible, when they believed that that frontier had closed, Alaska stood out to them as potentially a new site for military adventure, which of course in reality entailed a great deal of violence and conflict with native peoples who lived there. But when you look at it from another angle, Alaska never had a very, it was never clear to either military or business people or politicians at the time what kind of role Alaska would actually serve for the country as a whole. And they were uncertain often how to think about it. So it has an inconsistent role, or I sometimes describe it as it has a kind of chameleon-like quality, as it seems to be both somewhere that's very useful, lucrative, strategically important, and one that makes the United States extremely vulnerable to attack, because it is a sort of a promontory that extends out into indefensible territory, and therefore a sense of fear or trepidation about this acquisition is attached to it. On the one hand, the idea that Alaska could in fact be a first frontier, bridging the continental conquest of Western territories with a new commercial expansion into Asia, gave it a sort of an important place within this new phase of American expansion. But it also, especially in the era of air power, came to seem less like a part of the West and more like the real center of a new world where the space between different countries and their militaries appeared to have radically collapsed because of the ability of air power and intercontinental ballistic missiles to traverse the skies in ways that had previously been impossible. And this realization, especially by people like Billy Mitchell, who became known in the United States as the most a significant proponent of the new air power. Mitchell had been in Alaska as a younger man. He had laid the first telegraph line across the territory between 1901 and 1903, and it was he who said in a congressional hearing in 1935 that whoever holds Alaska will hold the world. And the reason that he thought that was precisely because, the U.S. Air Force now takes very seriously, the largest city in Alaska, the capital, Anchorage, is about equidistant from New York City, Tokyo, and Murmansk, which is Russia's ice-free port in the Arctic Circle, and it's also within 10 hours flight of 90% of the northern hemisphere. So it has this extremely strategic location, and so the focus of my chapter is to take up that tension between its marginality and its centrality at different points of U.S. Geopolitical imaginings. And I think it very usefully connects us well to both the social history of the U.S. military in the American West and to the global geopolitical and inter-imperial competition between the 19th century and the Cold War, precisely because so many big characters in U.S. history turn up there at one point or another. And, perhaps that's surprising, but perhaps it's not, because it was the type of place that attracted those who saw it as this, frontier of new adventure. So people like Henry Halleck, who was the commanding general of the U.S. Army in the Civil War, but also Irving Howe and Gore Vidal, who were stationed there during the Second World War and wrote letters and novels about their time in Alaska. Some of those letters are sadly lost, but we do have some pictures of Howe and the others while they were there. And so thinking about this, what was the geopolitical role that Alaska served for those who were charged with making the transition from continental supremacy to a global military posture after the Second World War. Well, in World War II itself, the Army was able to use it as a site for managing some of the racial tensions that were emerging in the segregated Army. So they used it as a place for segregation, punishment, and the dumping, in particular, of black troops who had been involved in mutinies in the lower 48, mutinies related to their unequal treatment and to the punitive character of American military justice, to segregate them from white women in other port cities where they were thought to be a threat, and they were used to, like other racialized laborers in the history of the West, they were used to carry out these very difficult manual labor jobs, building the Alaska Highway and the railroad under really extremely difficult conditions, very harsh winters. Alaska always has harsh winters, but the winters of 42 and 43, when this road was being built, were unusually harsh, and so they suffered immensely for the work that they did. And then the road immediately became useless once the war moved down and further into the South Pacific. In the Cold War, Alaska became an important forward staging area for the power projection, for nuclear power projection against the Soviet Union, and today it remains a site of intense geopolitical competition as the polar ice caps are melting, and a group of nations who have borders on the Arctic, who belong to an organization called the Arctic Council, are struggling over what the sovereignty of this region will be, because the strategic importance of a sea lane across the Arctic Circle is immensely important, but there's also potential riches to be discovered there in terms of oil and fishing rights and other lucrative business prospects. So the U.S. Army then, in its sort of most recent strategy document, has described the United States as an Arctic nation whose goal in the next generation must be to regain Arctic dominance. The contestation is particularly acute with Russia, of course, especially in Norway and Finland at the moment, but it's also a posture that has a lot to do with China, because China has secured a seat on this Arctic Council as a near-Arctic nation and has claimed that the Arctic is one of three regions in the world, if we think about space, the seabed, and the poles, where sovereignty is undetermined. So they want to contest for sovereignty. They say that the initial territorial or maritime boundaries can't stand there. It has to be decided politically. And so we can expect enormous contestation in this region in the future. So my chapter will bring us up to that point, and after that, we don't know.
Hi, good evening. Thank you again for coming out, and for to the organizers of both this volume and for our hosts here at SMU. It's been a wonderful experience. My paper, my contribution to the volume is on the U.S.-Mexico border, the modern U.S.-Mexico border and the frontier. And with the upcoming presidential elections, which we see and hear about all the time, issues like border security, immigration, asylum, these are things that the two presidential candidates couldn't have more different views on. But I think that we can say that they agree on one thing, and it's this idea that there is a crisis at the southern border. And I think that this is something that we can kind of look at historically as well. I mean, the U.S.-Mexico border region continues to represent, not solely the demarcation between two sovereign nations, but some might argue it's a region or a zone that is perpetually in a state of political, social, and sometimes military conflict. And so to kind of bring it back to my paper, it employs the frontier to understand how the border space continues to be a marginalized kind of area, a separation, and in some instances, and here we're looking at during the era of Prohibition, with the inauguration of the so-called war on drugs, it continues to be this space outside the law where Americans traverse down in search of vice at different historical moments. And I explore the history of U.S. exclusionary policies at the border, which have been explored by academics and policymakers inside and outside the historical field, their origins in the 19th century, and their logic and form throughout the 20th century. They are often fear-based and invoke a sense of danger, which I think is a theme that some of our papers have looked at in this collection at different moments in time. And by looking at this history, I explore the question of whether the sorts of familiar characteristics of the frontier can be imposed, can be imposed by the construction of modern U.S. border security apparatus to keep the U.S. and Mexico separate. And I mean, what the role is of these exclusionary policies in creating a sort of healthy distance between the United States and Mexico. And I mean, one can see this during Prohibition. One can see this more recently with the construction of NAFTA. And in my forthcoming book, I spent a long time discussing that. I mean, there was this great promise that came with the passage of the North American Free Trade Agreement, inaugurated in 1994, but the public relations campaign that preceded it here in the United States was enormous. In the extent that, we could pull Mexico up by the bootstraps, there could be sort of this free trade bloc, but it had to come with these exclusionary policies. And it really kind of exposes, and to kind of bring it to the present, these undersides of the U.S.-Mexico relationship and the forces at play, that kind of make it run. A secondary concern of the paper is taking a historical perspective to understand the rationale of these exclusionary policies. Despite thousands of military troops deployed to the border at different moments in time and a $1 billion border security apparatus, I mean, there is this sort of question over time of when will Americans feel safe? And I mean, this is sort of this elusive quest for safety is something that, that's cyclical, that has a long historical trajectory. And I mean, kind of stepping back, I think by looking at these exclusionary policies in the context of the frontier, I mean, maybe American safety really isn't the point of these policies. And so I think my paper more broadly seeks to understand the disconnect, and I was kind of encouraged by my colleagues in conversations about the paper today, that in situating my paper as this kind of effort to understand the disconnect between what actually happens at the border and then how those who construct border policies, these border crises that I just spoke of a couple of minutes ago, I mean, the drastic disconnect between the border policies and those who make them and what actually happens at the border. So yeah, it's more or less what I'm doing here.
Good evening, everyone. I'm conscious that I am the one that's keeping you from asking questions. So I will keep it concise. And I want to say at the beginning, thank you so much to Cecily and Jeff and Andy for asking me to be part of this, and to Rana for making this happen, because nothing happens unless Rana's involved. So very thankful for all four of them. And I'll say when Cecily approached me about writing something for this volume, I'll say at the outset, I am not a borderland scholar. And so I started thinking, okay, I work on the far right. What can I write about in thinking about the far right in the West? And I had just finished the most recent season of Fargo. And if any of you watched the most recent season of Fargo, John Hamm plays a far right sheriff who goes on a reign of terror. And I started thinking about constitutional sheriffs. Is anyone in this room, as a show of hands, familiar with constitutional sheriffs, if they know what I'm talking about? We've got 3, 4 maybe. Fantastic. So constitutional sheriffs are a fairly recent phenomenon. I'm talking basically since 2020. And their belief is that they are the direct enforcers of the Constitution. They believe that there is no authority, be that the president, a state official, a local official, a mayor, that can essentially tell them what to do. And that derives from two unique aspects of the sheriff's position vis-a-vis other kinds of law enforcement. So a sheriff is elected. You go and vote for your sheriff in whatever county you're a part of, and you decide who your sheriff is. Second, sheriffs are not subjected to the same kind of civilian oversight that you might think about with other kinds of police. So if you think about the kinds of civilian oversight boards that were put in place after the murder of George Floyd in 2020, those don't apply to sheriffs. And so groups like the constitutional sheriffs really come out of those two realities of how sheriffs are different and then turn that temperature up to 100. And they're firmly part of what you might call the Trumpian ecosystem. They work across really three major issues these days. The first is COVID denialism. So these are people that you might be familiar named Dar Leaf or Richard Mack, who basically said, we're not enforcing whatever COVID restrictions you put into place, and that you're saying that the law is making us do that. Essentially, I am the law, and I am the only representative in my county that can make these decisions. They're also really involved in anti-immigrant activity, which connects to what Aileen was just discussing, particularly on the border. And third is they're heavily involved in election denialism. And this might be, for those of you who are familiar with them, where you most often see them, these sort of extremely false investigations into rigged elections and rigged voting machines. And so I started really thinking about constitutional sheriffs through my work as a scholar on the far right. And I regret to inform you that Donald Trump does not explain everything. He explains a lot of things, but I started thinking about the constitutional sheriffs, and they're treated as this hyper-contemporary movement, and that they emerge basically once Trump becomes president, and that they're really catalyzed by everything that happens in 2020. And so I started to think about, what is the actual place that these sheriffs come from? And they're from a much longer legacy, and I started to think about that maybe putting them back in their place in the frontier is the right way to think about where these sheriffs come from. And I'm a historian primarily of the 70s and 80s, and there's some major changes in the way that federal power looks in the American West that these organizations, their earlier versions, are really pulling on. And so if you know your history of the American West, you know the far right has always been active in the American West, specifically around things like land use, around religion, around environmentalism, and that there's a space of general anger at the federal government around conservation, farming in the 1980s, that these organizations really come on. And so the 1980s precursor of the constitutional sheriffs movement is a group called Posse Comitatus. They are extremely Christian nationalists. They are incredibly anti-Semitic. They are violently racist. And what they spend their time doing in the 80s is really organizing against what they see as an overreach of federal power, specifically from what they see as the nationalization of police coming out of the war on crime. And so the first part of my chapter really looks at all of the ways that Posse Comitatus thinks about this encroachment of national power, that it's targeting them. They specifically talk about the role of national policing, the expansion of prisons on the frontier, and interestingly, they talk a lot about FEMA. And for those of you that are following, I'm a North Carolinian, that are following the conspiracies around FEMA that are happening in the state right now, that is a huge part still of how the far right thinks about and critiques federal power. But I was also really not persuaded by their anti-federal critique, because I also spend part of my chapter looking at the activity of the Ku Klux Klan on the US-Mexico border in the same period. And for those of you that are familiar with what happens in California, you have Ku Klux Klan chapters that are actively arresting people they perceive to be Mexican nationals crossing the border and handing them over to Border Patrol. And they talk a lot about that they see their relationship as hand in glove with US Border Patrol, and that they're doing them a service, and that they are taking their cues from US national law enforcement. And so the reason that I put these two together is because when we think about the US militia movement of the 1990s, we talk about it as an explicitly anti-state movement. We're thinking about the Oklahoma City bombing, we're thinking about Waco, we're thinking about Ruby Ridge. And I think there's a risk of really completely buying into their rhetoric that they are anti-state first. And what happens when you look at sheriffs who are part of the state apparatus, whether they say they are or not, is there is a more complicated relationship to federal power that is about who is being policed and what does that vision look like. And explicitly, it is white people should not be policed, and if you're not white, you should be. And that is the vision that really comes out of this earlier version of constitutional sheriffs, if you look at the 80s and 90s in organizations like Pose Comitatus. And so one of the great things about being in a volume like this is being able to have conversations that really link it to this imagined idea of the frontier that the far right is really pulling on, of this lone cowboy out on the frontier, and this idea that the West was open for the white man to engage with the space as he chose. And so chronologically, I'm near the end of the volume, and I think it's important in the current contemporary ecosystem to look back and find a place when we think about law enforcement and policing and the far right, and really think about its role in the frontier. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you all. Those were 5 fascinating presentations from 5 fascinating chapters. We do have the opportunity for questions, and I will ask Dr. Franklin. While we are waiting for the first question, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for these excellent thoughts that you've given us to think on. My question is on the role of public opinion during this time. So it could really be anybody who wants to speak on this, but I'm interested in the way that public opinion about the frontier and about expansion, loosely defined, shifted over the course of the century, and how that may have interacted with presidential policies and presidential decision-making.
Which century? 20th century?
Just because I went last and give my panelists time to think. So I think one of the really interesting parts about what the people that I'm talking about in the 80s and 90s are really pulling on is the bedrock of anger at the federal government that's happening in the West, specifically around conservation and land. So some of you may be familiar with the Sagebrush Rebellion and the way that different state legislatures in the West, a swath of activists, and it's not just Republicans or just Democrats, but are thinking about anger about how the federal government under Reagan is conserving land and what that looks like. And so what's really important when you're talking about conservatism is that you bring in that it is a spectrum, and that Pose is so far right. Like, this is not a popular person. They make their money by robbing banks. Like, that's not a joke. That's how they make their money and influence, and many of them die rightfully in complete lack of notoriety. But there is a landscape of anger, what they see as federal overreach in the West, that I think is a huge part of the way that they are able to gain traction, particularly when you think about like the farming crisis, where you do have sort of cross-pollination between farmers who are angry about the crisis and groups like Pose. So I think that's the kind of federal place where I see the presidency and the decision-making from the White House that is impacting the landscape that they operate.
Other thoughts?
So I would say that public perception is incredibly important when it comes to federal Indian policy. That very often there's kind of a priming of the public before a policy can change. And not that that's necessarily chicken egg kind of argument, that both are obviously happening at the same time, but there's something fundamentally different about the ward-guardian relationship as spelled out by Marshall in the 1830s than there is an individual ward to guardians of individual, say, Osage people, as opposed to guardians of an entire nation, right? So there's something that shifts in that time, and part of it is public perception. And in fact, we were having a conversation today about Grant's peace policy happening in the 1870s, that people aren't going to forget about treaties immediately, because people have been living with treaties for a very long time. But a generation later, people haven't grown up with treaties. Treaties have been put behind. There's a whole new kind of public opinion around treaties, that we don't do that anymore. And so it becomes easier to have a different kind of conversation about federal Indian policy if people are no longer thinking like, oh, we write treaties with tribes, and that we can in fact treat them as individuals, right? That's a big difference. That undermines the kind of corporate rights of Native nations. I would say even now, being able to make this play for the delegate is happening because there's a certain kind of public perception right now that we couldn't have done this in the 50s. We couldn't, there were other moments when it wouldn't have played as well. And in fact, I commented to the group that when my uncle was an official of the Cherokee Nation, that in the 90s, that's when I learned about the delegate provision before I went back to graduate school. But that was also when the Cherokee Nation was engaged in was working up to expelling the freedmen. And that wasn't playing very well to a kind of larger public. So we're in a different place now. So there's kind of the politics of what Native nations are up to that is informing the public, but I also think there's other kinds of educations. And Rose Stremlau, also, who's a historian of Cherokee history, but also my co-author on this book, describes the kind of educational uplift that Cherokee people constantly have to do to educate everyone else about who they are. So whether that's thinking about the Cherokee Phoenix as a national organ to tell people about the removal crisis, or whether that's the many delegations that the Cherokee Nation sent to Washington over the course of the late 19th century, or whether that's our chief going out and meeting with representatives today and attempting to talk to people, that's all public relations, and it's a certain kind of education that has to happen with the larger public about Native nations and about Cherokees specifically. So I think they go hand in hand, which is also what always makes me nervous with the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court is, we love to think that it stands outside of public opinion, but who are we kidding, right? Like that it often matches some public opinion at times, that it's not as if it always operates outside of public opinion.
The messaging around sort of this out-of-control border has, appeared in the historical literature for a long time. It was powerful enough to rationalize 2 U.S. military interventions in Mexico between 1910 and 1920 during the Mexican Revolution. And that's continued onward in different ways. One interesting example is by the late 1960s, more Americans are getting their news via television than newspapers. And television archives now allow us to kind of go in and see how the U.S. public was learning about Mexico and the border, because, we live in Texas, we think we know the border, but most Americans don't necessarily go to the border or traverse it or understand, what it's like, to live on the border and to kind of go back and forth between the two nations. And I think it's interesting because much of public opinion, especially as you go into the more recent decades on Mexico and border crises, is a mix of, especially from the vantage point of television news, it's a mix of like somewhat factual and then also a bit of dramatization as well. And I don't say that to be glib, but these are how most Americans, especially those that don't live in border states, are learning about Mexico and are forming these very powerful opinions about Mexico that we see in the news today. And to kind of bring it back to this question of how that affects presidential administrations, I deal with posse comitatus in my work, but in a very different way than Augusta does, in that in 1986, the Reagan administration passed National Security Decision Directive 221, which sort of overhauled the respect for posse comitatus law, which prevented the military from being able to be involved in, for example, domestic policing. And since then, I mean, we've seen the development of Joint Task Force 6. I mean, there's this sort of active policing in the border that's very much connected to this idea of public perception and the way in which the United States, or the way in which Americans understand sort of an inherent danger that's coming from Mexico. And I think that you definitely can't get away from understanding how that relates to the formation of policy.
I can say something briefly just about the stunning transformation, I suppose, in public opinion about Alaska in a short space of time, because unlike some of the other territories that came into U.S. possession, it was not met with celebratory jubilation to do with the expansion and glory of the nation, but the political cartoons that appeared, mocking Seward and his polar bears, and the wastefulness of this amount of money that had been spent at a time when the nation, of course, was extremely preoccupied with the Civil War and the consequences of it, and they were much less concerned about the, I suppose, geopolitical imperative, which was to continue what had been the policies of purchasing and annexing territories elsewhere, namely like getting European powers off of the American continent. But then both the discovery of gold and the development of an enormous tourism industry, which were accompanied by very powerful and dramatic ads about the natural beauty of Alaska that really played into some of these ideas about its vastness, its impenetrability, the idea that you could seek an adventure there in the same way that British Victorian novelists were writing about the Congo or parts of Africa at the same time. There was a sort of parallel project to encourage people to go to Alaska, and they went, and about 5,000 people went there in the 1890s. They took the new technologies, trains and steamships, and so then it became an idea of a sort of a paradise where one could exempt oneself from the alienation of modern civilization in the East. But it also, I suppose, came around at the same time that the climbing of mountains started to become a part of a broader recommitment to, martial masculinity and the strenuous life that Theodore Roosevelt talked often about. Alaska has half of the tallest mountains in North America, but most of the tall mountains in the world weren't being climbed until this period at the turn of the 20th century, and so people would go up, and that legacy that it has, right, as a tourist haven, remains today. Many of us who are not American encounter Alaska for the first time in something like the Simpsons movie, where it has that idyllic vista, and that campaign was extremely successful. And so even as people also still sort of think about it as they're not quite sure if it's fully American, and certainly in the Second World War, where nobody was clear about whether the Japanese invasion had actually taken place on U.S. soil or not, it still remains as a kind of a haven for Americans.
TJ, do you have anything you want to add on this point?
Well, I mean, I don't know if anybody wants to hear me talk about it.
I do.
I mean, this is a very interesting question because it works in both directions. So when I think about, for example, the 1876 war between the U.S. and the Lakota, this had its origins actually in U.S. military weakness, and that the Army had been progressively shrunk after the Civil War. And so in the 1870s, as the U.S. Army was facing a series of climactic wars across the West, Sheridan, who commanded in the West, was concerned about the Lakotas, one of the most powerful armed independent nations in the West. And so he sent Custer in 1874 to scout a site for a fort in the Black Hills. Custer discovered gold. As many people expected, they were looking for gold and expecting it to be there. And that sparked a rush. And this was not what the Grant administration had planned on. They had not planned on a major military adventure to secure the Black Hills, but that's what they ended up with because of the rush there. And the Army had been actually assigned to keep the miners out. And they eventually decided, because it was in keeping with, again, this developmental imperative. The Congress that, like I said, had revoked treaty making, it also passed the 1872 mining law, and it had pushed all these other multiple new transcontinental railroads, which the Army escorted. There was a policy of pushing into native space in the West, what I call, and apparently I have to change my term, the world system of the native world, that was treated by the European world system by the United States as, Native nations are treated as foreign bodies within, this land that they had laid out boundaries over. And so they were tolerated basically as long as they could fight back. And then once they were defeated militarily, the process of breaking down Native autonomy and sovereignty and cultures really took off. And so by the time so on one hand, popular opinion, popular momentum drives the Grant administration into a war of dispossession. By the time you get to just really only a few years later when Roosevelt goes out to the Dakota Territory and he starts voicing, that Natives never had any title to the land, this is belongs to us. He's voicing a consensus opinion. And he then uses that as an opinion maker, as a historian, as a popular thinker and public intellectual, as a defense for U.S. imperialism. And he begins to argue that the right, the justice of taking all these waste spaces, as he defined them, because they were not being used in the European way, then the U.S. is part of that world. The resources are not being exploited. The land is not being used in the proper way. So therefore it is waste. Therefore legally it is uninhabited, even though obviously it's inhabited. Even though a lot of Native nations had engaged in various forms of agriculture and horticulture and had fortified settlements, which Washington actually campaigned to destroy, George Washington, that idea that the only legitimate use, the only legitimate polities are a part of the European world system and everything else. We may say we want to make citizens of them, but that's their distinctiveness must be broken down so they can be absorbed. That's actually, by the time we get to him, he's articulating something that is very widely accepted. And then he's applying it then to foreign adventures as well. We have to civilize the Filipinos. We have the right to assert, the Anglo-American race's role in the world. And he's projecting that forward. And again, the least attractive side of him. But for him, that's as much a part of, good governance as conserving nature and as providing, good government and counterbalancing private power in the corporate world. To him, it's all one continuum.
Well, unfortunately, we have exhausted much of our time, but not all of it. And I'm going to take the prerogative of asking a couple of questions in a speed round. So I'm going to ask this first question, and I want you just to give your immediate answer based upon the time upon which your chapter is focused. Where is the West? Speed, come on.
First, in terms of Roosevelt, we're definitely talking about, the High Plains, the 100th Meridian and West, that the mountain states and the High Plains he sees as West, though he also is thinking in terms of, defending the acquisition of Hawaii within the Monroe Doctrine. He's thinking about the Monroe Doctrine as kind of an extension of his thinking of the West. So, he is on the cusp of the century when he's beginning to make a connection with the new imperial adventures abroad.
Good. Next.
But I dealt with 3 centuries in my paper.
Make a choice.
Oh, goodness. That's why I go to the Southern, the Western, and so, the West at a certain point is the westernmost point of the Cherokee Nation and the Appalachians. The West is Oklahoma, and the West is now a borderless space where all Cherokee people are living as a result of the diaspora from allotment.
Good, sir.
I think it would have to be in the Second World War, the Rat Islands at the western end of the Aleutian chain, because this is the tail that sort of, that gives, it's almost, the tail itself is almost as wide as the territorial part of Alaska, and that was where both the American servicemen who went there understood themselves as really being on the edge of the world, but it was also, of course, the place where the removal of native peoples back towards the east took place, so you had this sort of counter-movement occurring in this sort of, in the crucible of war.
I think the West becomes most pronounced in my paper in 1895, actually, toward the beginning, where there's a border commission that's sent out to map the U.S.-Mexico boundary. It endures a lot of difficulties, and it's this period of time where I think that I would locate the West more, where the border was very ill-defined. It wasn't figurative. It sort of existed between these two nations, but there was a lot of, I guess, flexibility between both countries to kind of define it as they wish, as well as some of the native population and and others. So I feel like I would take it to the turn of the century.
I'm going to say that the West is in the imagination of the far right in my story.
Oh,
and
nice alliteration.
One of the parts of this is one of the most active groups that I look at is based in Wisconsin, which I'm pretty sure is not the West, but they're fixated on their idea of it. So I'm going to say it's in their imaginations. So
Interesting. Okay, we have 2 more questions for you in the speed round. The next is, in the time period that you focus upon, please feel free to pick one, where is there a frontier?
Oh, wow. Well, I mean, when Roosevelt goes west, it's, he's actually in what's considered the frontier, the far western edge of the Dakota Territory, where ranchers have moved in and they're basically squatting. And he envisions a future in which small farmers are going to go in and plow the soil and farm, which never materializes, for geographical reasons. But he very much, identifies with that frontier of the ranching country in the high plains, northern plains.
The frontier is how we imagine voting rights moving forward and representation moving forward. And what we can imagine, that it doesn't have to stay the same. It can change, and it has.
I think it changes and moves as well, because you get in the 19th century the sort of frontier of American efforts to expand into the sort of continental heartland of Alaska, which is clashing with the native polities who reside there. In the Second World War, you have like a real frontier with the Japanese, right? The sense of two like nations colliding militarily. But later in the war, and then also in the Cold War, the frontier at the Arctic Circle, where Lend-Lease aid in the war is going over to Russia, and then the pushing up north that's going to open up the entire globe to U.S. air supremacy, becomes the sort of like, it's like Kennedy's like final frontier in space.
I would agree that the sort of the spatiality of the frontier is changing across time, but kind of pinned down to provide one answer, I would say the frontier is 100 miles inward from the U.S.-Mexico border, where the Border Patrol has its jurisdiction and can act sort of as it wishes in certain periods of time. And I say the Border Patrol, but I think that's intended to signify more broadly sort of the jurisdiction of different enforcement agencies that operate at the U.S.-Mexico border.
I'm tempted to steal Eileen's great answer because I also wrote about Border Patrol. So I think Aileen nailed it. But if I had to come up with my own authentic answer, I would also say the far right believes that it is at the frontier of combating federal power after the U.S. has won the Cold War. That they talk about that this is their battle against the American state.
Last question, your final answer. This is probably the only question that matters at the end of the day. Raise your hand if you are important. Yeah, if you're important. Only one of you on this stage is important. No. Only one of you votes in the state of Pennsylvania. Raise your hand if you vote in the state of Pennsylvania. That's you. Thank you. Okay. Perhaps you haven't gotten enough notice from the campaigns that you're voting. I mentioned this not just because it's important to point out the stupidity of the Electoral College from time to time, but more importantly, because we do have an election coming up, perhaps you've heard, and I wanted to highlight our next event for the Center for Presidential History, which is on October 29th. We are doing the second of our third rail events, where we are going to demonstrate that you can discuss difficult topics, in this case, the future of our nation, in a civil and polite fashion. We are going to have 2 individuals discussing the proposed foreign foreign policies of each of the major presidential campaigns, as the Trump and the Harris campaigns. October 29th, I strongly encourage you to come to this. It should be very, very good. We have good people coming out for that. And there is one other thing which I would like to do in addition to, once more, thanking our panelists, thanking yesterday's panelists, thanking all the contributors. Also, the Clements Center, the George W. Bush Library, the DeGloyer Library, the Debman College Interdisciplinary Institute. They need a shorter name. And also, I want to give a big thank you to Kate Hodorowitz from UNC Press, who is going to be publishing the volume. And as far as I'm concerned, a successful conference is one where you can hold the book at the end. So thank you, Kate, for your help in that. And thank you all for coming out tonight. Appreciate it.